Yeah.
So all of my work is about power and love in the end. It's usually about looking at a big system and trying to understand where the power imbalance is between people and professionals, and thinking how can we redesign that system so that people can actually realise their real capabilities, so they can seize the opportunities that are there in the right way. And I guess the love side of it is about, well, I guess what Charlie Leadbeater calls creating intimacy at scale. So how do we design big systems that still have empathy and relationships at their heart?
Can you just talk a bit more about sort of why you think that's important?
Yeah, I think over time public services have become much more personalised, but they've also become much more transactional. So when we think about personalisation, we think, let's take a sort of menu of services and make them available to people so they can pick and choose, but essentially you're still wrapping the same set of services around people. And I guess I'm interested in what happens if you build services on relationships, is that you have a different kind of value wrapped up in that goes beyond what's on offer. And, you know, we know that relationships are important in ways we didn't understand before. So the link between loneliness and dementia, or the fact that 80% of people find work through word of mouth, you know, sort of holding them in a queue in the job centre isn't going to get them where they need to be.
I'm just going to stop for a minute. Is that...
Am I loud enough?
Yeah, do we need to move... Is it loud enough?
I think it should be okay.
Do you want to
check it?
Check.
You won't be able to hear it on that, because I always have to do up the volume anyway.
So you record it on this?
Then edit it.
And then put the sound to the...
Uh-huh.
God, I hope you're going to get that right. I shouldn't doubt that. But like, as in...
Synchronisation.
Yeah.
There's nothing worse.
You put them over each other so you can tell when they echo.
Wow, that's clever.
Thanks.
I didn't realise you were doing that. So you're not recording sound with that at all?
No, I am. It's so you can cross-reference it on the phone,
okay.
so you know exactly where.
Should I do some of those, like yawning?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So in terms of what you want to change in the system, it's how it's the nature of relationships, or the value we put on relationships, and taking away.
Yeah, well, a lot of it is that I think especially the public services we have are not sustainable in the long term. So how do you fundamentally rethink what the purpose of those services is, and then how you design them to be sustainable, so that people... And a lot of the work that I do is thinking how, instead of rationing what's on offer to people and sort of going down that sort of very closed route, how do you think about building systems and services that get stronger with participation rather than being burdened by demand?
How important... I'm going to come back to that, because I think we'll cut this out anyway.
Yeah.
How important is it to articulate the vision of the future for you? Like how much do you need to see or feel or know what you're working towards?
I think articulating that vision for what the future of a service or a system can be is crucial, partly because we have some new social problems that we don't know how to solve. So imagining the systems within which we might redress them is important for everybody to get behind that vision. But also because we have to rethink the purpose of some of these systems. So, for example, imagining what a wellness system might look like as opposed to an illness system. And if you can begin to imagine that, then you can start to see what's feasible or possible within that didn't appear as an opportunity before. So I think sometimes when we take a problem-solving approach, we tend to only see the problems. And actually, by creating a vision for the future, you can see many more opportunities, which also gives you freedom to bring in different stakeholders and different partners who might also see opportunities for themselves within that can shift the paradigm in that direction.
And can you talk a bit more about the differences, or give an example of designing thinking through problem lens and then designing just imagining the future, like?
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's very easy to describe. I think there's something in there about problem framing and how we describe the problem in the first place. Because if you simply describe the problem as it's seen through the eyes of the existing system constraints, then it looks quite narrow and locked down. Whereas if you find a way to turn it on its head or rethink what the ultimate goal is, then new opportunities appear that weren't there before, and that can have its own momentum. I think of good examples of that. I mean, for example, in the health industry, thinking about a wellness service rather than an illness service also helps insurers think about new markets that they can move into. It helps people see their own the roles that they can play within it differently.
And in terms of that vision, then, with the work you've done, how do you share that with stakeholders or with wider? So.
Yeah, in a way, it's quite a bold thing to do, to say, okay, we're going to stop thinking about health and illness, and we're going to think about wellness, or we're going to stop thinking about jobs and employment, and we're going to think about employability over the long term. And we're actually going to imagine what that looks like and then start to build the components that will make it happen. And I think one of the most important roles that I play in that process is to hold the space of uncertainty for our stakeholders. So they are often worried about what that means for the systems that they operate in right now, or the services that they're delivering right now. And so, does that mean that we're going to throw the whole thing out? Or does it mean that those two visions can coexist for a while until we figure out how we start moving towards that new thing? I think it's a bit like people talk about emergent strategy and being able to allow that to emerge at the same time as you're running business as usual.
I know this is really hard to answer probably, but in terms of that, the sort of coexisting, two things coexisting, do you have can you think of any examples of that? Or just talk a little bit more about sort of what that feels like, or what determines then how or why one drops off, or...
Yeah, I think we're very early in understanding that through our own practice. We can see it happening in other areas. You often see sort of big technology companies like Microsoft or Yahoo picking up innovations that they've seen on the margins, like Flickr, where that suddenly moves from being the sort of example on the edges into the mainstream and becomes a main way of doing it. Or thinking about how Avis has bought Zipcar, and isn't that interesting? But in terms of work that I have done, I think probably the most interesting example for us has been Southwark Circle and circles in general, and how, to start with, when we first launched our very first circle, we didn't know how to position it because there's nothing like it on the market, so we didn't know how to talk about it or what to compare it to. And then over time, we've seen that local authorities have actually changed their tendering processes. So some of the tenders are now modelled on a circle-like service. So effectively, we've been able to change the market for solutions. And they are sort of coexisting alongside services that the council are currently providing, and gradually they're figuring out how to move those services across. So I guess I'd say that Circle is based on a very different infrastructure. So it's not based on buildings and minibuses and things like that. It's based on networks and relationships. And as that gets stronger, then you can put more and more of existing council services onto that platform.
One more question on vision is just, you talk so articulately about how, like about the vision that you have. What kinds of skills or knowledge do you think you need to be able to create
that? Yeah, it's funny you should ask that. I've been thinking about this quite a lot, and I think one of the most powerful things we use in that process is narrative. So if I think about how we did our employability work, so first of all we reframe the goal. So we say it's not about a job at any cost, it's about how you build employability over the long term. So that changes your thinking anyway. And with the employability work, I think all we really had to do was to say, here's the current narrative that people are part of when they're looking for work. So here's how the job centre makes them feel, here's how they understand their role in that. And actually when you look at that, you see that it's a very fast downward spiral. So people feel a huge sense of shame and a sort of loss of status, and their social fitness declines really quickly. So they don't want to tell people that they're unemployed, or they don't have much to talk about. So they start to drop out of social contact, and they feel that when they're at the job centre, there's no way of differentiating themselves from everybody else around them. So it's a very powerful downward spiral, and all we had to do really was to reverse that and say what kind of system would give people a sense of progress and momentum and status and allow them to differentiate themselves and to connect to people on an equal basis. And then you start to see that there's a kind of disconnect between, we keep unemployed people separate to employed people, although actually if we think about career progression across both sides of that, then you end up with a very different kind of system where actually everybody's an asset in that, because everybody has connections and relationships that can be useful to everybody else. So it really changes the nature of what's on offer.
So the next question is about theory of change, but I guess, I mean, really, it's like, how do you think change happens, and what's your experience of how?
So I think I've generally swung backwards and forwards between thinking you need to do this on the outside or you need to do this on the inside. And over time we've found that actually creating these new services or systems outside of what's there already is more effective. Mainly because we can set the culture ourselves, we can hire people who actually embody that new culture, we can move more quickly, we can act as a kind of attractor for the early adopters and get a kind of sort of alliance feeling around that, or a feeling of kind of people are joining it because it's a kind of a rejection of what's there just now, so it has a particular energy to it that drives it forward. I think then the second question becomes, how do you bridge that to the existing system? Because what doesn't always happen is that I think when we started this work, we really thought that what we built would start to eat away at the incumbent systems. And sometimes that has happened, but often it hasn't. And there are different reasons for that. So Charlie Leadbeater and Laura Bunt wrote about decommissioning services at the same time as you build new things. And we've definitely found that has to be a priority. So as much as you can invest in the new, you also have to invest in dismantling the old. So I'd say that my theory of change is about the new market entrants, but there has to be at the same time some deliberate market creation. So you're putting things out there that people want, and that commissioning structures and other kind of purchasing structures can actually purchase, and then think about how you do start to shift the resources from one to the other.
And do you think the decommissioning or the dismantling of what's not working, if it needs to be done sort of in tandem, do you think that works well as being done by the same group of people, or is that something that happens separately but at the same time?
Yeah, that's a question I have about working inside the system. So I'm just about to start working with a mental health trust in Merseyside who are very committed to changing business as usual. So they want to begin to innovate at a systems level that means that they dismantle some of the services that they already have. But I can feel already that that's a real tension for them, and it's so whether you can actually, I don't know whether to what extent that's really possible.
Yeah. Or if it can be done by the same team of people that are also trying to introduce the new.
Yes, I mean I think a lot of this. I mean now we're probably more talking about how you do disruptive innovation rather than systems change, because you can really only do that if you have somebody at the top who's able to hold both tracks, so building the new thing and allowing the space in the existing system for that to happen. And I think the commitment there to start to shift resources has to come from the top. So I think, yes, you can have the sort of agitation from over here, but you have to have the real courage and commitment from the team that's running the service at the moment.
And so going back to the work you've done and the work you might go on to do, who are your allies and fellow travellers?
Yeah, I was stuck on this question because other than all the people that you're interviewing.
So are there people or organisation, I mean it might not be people, it might be, are there people or organisations that you regularly have to have on board or alongside you, like a type of organisation for your sort of theory of change to work, or is that not really necessary in what you've been doing?
Yeah, I think we always need a location partner to prove that something works on the ground and to have their endorsement of it, if you like. I also think what's been important for us is to have partners who are as visionary as we are, so who are not unsettled by the uncertainty of the process, and also really committed to bigger system change, who see their own part in it but want to sort of elevate it to the next level and do something bigger. And I think that also applies to funding partners who are willing to go with us on a journey over the long term. So realise that some things that come out of this systems innovation process will be kind of able to be put into practice quickly, but some things take much longer time to reach their full potential, and that needs long-term backing. So I think we've also done very good work where we've had we had JP Morgan on our employability work, and we've had Guy's and St Thomas's charity on our health work, and I think they're both partners that have that longer term vision. A lot of what I talk about is a bit of a sort of cliche. So I quite often think that what I'm talking about is quite naive.
Really?
Sort of naive optimism. You can build these things and then the rest of the the system will just comply. It doesn't really comply.
But it does sometimes, and eventually it might.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking yesterday when the story in the news was about the 15-minute care visits and how everybody's sort of outraged that happens, and thinking that's such a good opportunity to really make the point that if we need to build these systems on a different basis. We can't do it on that kind of 15-minute transactional social care kind of thing. And so sometimes I think it's a bit like Charlie's example of containerization. As soon as you take the container as the unit, then that changed the whole shipping industry. If we take relationships as the unit, that can really change the way we think about building those services in a different way, because then you're measuring different things and you're valuing different things, and the system has an impact.
What do you think? What are the challenges of at the moment? What are you coming up against in terms of the challenges of doing that? What do people need help to understand more? Or
yeah, I think I feel that many public commissioners want to be commissioning in a different way, and the metrics that they have to do that around don't necessarily tell them what to do or how to do it. Or they might have a very interesting vision about what they want to see out there in the world, but they then have a long list of providers who are providing the same old thing, and they need ways of stimulating innovation on that side. So I think a lot of the work that I end up doing is about trying to create something in the middle of that both stimulates the demand in a different way and shows other providers that there is a market for a new kind of service, and also stimulates the supply. Oh, did I get that the wrong way? I got that the wrong way round, didn't I? Yeah. Let me say that again. Yeah. So I think often what we're doing is building something in the middle of sort of supply and demand, where we're saying actually you can provide this different kind of service. So we're stimulating the supply side in that way, sort of proving that there is a market for this, and at the same time we're stimulating the demand side and saying be more ambitious about what could happen here, and by doing this, I think by creating these new services and systems, almost as kind of fast demonstrators, you start to see where the blocks are in the systems and regulations and protocols. So I think when we first developed Circle as a platform, the interesting thing about it was that we were able to mix different resources on the same platform. So we were able to have state resources, private resources, voluntary resources all mixed together, and that kind of increased the pot that was available. So it no longer looked like we needed to ration what we gave to older people, but actually it was a system that could get stronger. The more people were in it, the more resource there was. So that really made us think differently about the kind of time banking models that were out there that were very very effective, but also not reliable enough to happen at a bigger scale. And how would we make that mixing of economies actually viable? So I think when you build these things, you start to see the systemic barriers further up, and it felt like, or it still feels like, we could create new platforms and new protocols that allow other people to do new things that weren't possible before. And I think this is happening in the open data space. It's quite a good example. The sort of new identity protocols and things like that are allowing innovation to happen where it couldn't happen before.
I think you've talked already probably quite a bit in terms of strategies and tactics, but are there others that you feel like you haven't mentioned?
Yeah. Let me think. What was I thinking about? Yeah, I'm interested in the idea of sort of attacking a system from all different sides at once. So how do you look at the points in the system around which, if you were to really do something different, the whole thing would shift? And what's the value of doing those things at the same time so they collectively have greater impact? I think we started to do this with the employability work, in that we said, okay, we need to do something on the supply side so that people are more able to build networks and to use those connections. We also need to do something on the demand side, so we're helping small businesses to create jobs and opportunities, and also to build their own networks in the same way. And you can continue to look at that as a whole system. What are all the bits that need to be different? And I think what's interesting about that is that when you think about shifting a whole system, you're thinking about how you change the goal of that system. You're thinking about how you use a different kind of infrastructure. So I think a lot of the big changes that we've seen have been where things have suddenly been based on a new set of relationships or networks. So peer-to-peer banking is a really good example of that. It's a big institution that was kind of dominant. And then suddenly, because you disintermediate, then you have a very different system that's based on peer relationships. There's a great startup that's come out of Bethnal Green Ventures called Open Utility, who are doing the same with energy systems. So they're allowing people to connect directly to small producers and to choose where their electricity is coming from. And those kinds of, again, it's a power relationship, but it's a different infrastructure, so it allows a different kind of system to emerge. And I think what's important about making that paradigm shift is that you're not just measuring whether you're successful in the outcomes you're looking for, you're also measuring whether the characteristics that you started out with are holding true. So it's almost like saying, okay, we're going to reframe the problem, and we have a set of principles on which we think the new system should be built. So if we're able to demonstrate that we're holding true to those principles, then we should see a bigger paradigm shift. Because otherwise you can have better outcomes but still within the same unsustainable system. So you need to measure both the outcomes and the characteristics of the system.
And do you have any examples of that? Of like the kind of measuring the characteristics of a system?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I would really like the employability work to do, to say, if it's working well, then we should have people who feel as confident in work as they do out of work as they do in work, because they see it as a much longer journey and about maintaining their ability to find work and increase their career progression constantly over time. So I'd be looking for measures in that system that were about people's capabilities rather than job outcomes, but also were about, how do we have a system that people want to be part of? Because nobody wants to be part of the job centre when they're out of work right now. But it could be that we have a system that works when you're in work and out of work that you want to be part of all the time. Yeah. Good questions, Cathy.
Let's move on to the personal stuff now.
Yes. Blank notes on this bit.
Because I'm worried, because I'm so fascinated by process
Yeah.
as well, like that I have to make sure that I don't just ask process questions. I'm very good at emotional personal questions. Okay. Yeah, so how do you
Well, just let me say one last thing on the other bit, because I think sometimes we're building, it's not necessarily we are building a new system, but we're looking for, it's a case of organising some of the existing elements differently. So quite often I feel like looking into people's lives and seeing resources there that are not being used and then connecting them, usually through new technology, which makes a lot of this possible. And that is the thing that becomes the infrastructure for the new system.
And is that something like recombine, I guess is the word, or maybe that's not quite the word, because that would suggest they've already been discovered.
Exactly.
These things, but
I think it's more that there are latent things there that just need kind of a web putting over them that connects them differently.
And again, is that something you've done in past projects, or that's just something that you are starting another lens at which you're looking through stuff?
No, I think that is what happened with Circle. To give you a really concrete example, we flyered a couple of streets in East Dulwich right at the beginning of the prototyping process and said, there are people on your street, older people on your street, who would appreciate a hand from time to time. And a massive response. And that's totally different to advertising for volunteers for age concern or sort of older person's charity. And so it made you see the resource that was there in a different way and understand what might unlock it, so what the motivations are that might unlock that resource.
And is that about because it was local, because it was...
Yeah, the motivations of people were quite different. Some of it was that they knew that there were older people on their street, but they had no actual way of making the connection. So they didn't want to knock on their door and say, can I help you? They needed an introduction of some sort. And another thing was wanting their children to experience a sense of community that they didn't think was there right now. And a third reason was thinking, my own mother lives in the west coast of Scotland. I would want her to have that near her, so I'm going to make that happen here. They're very different motivations.
So, how do you describe your work?
Difficult. I think my work is all about swimming upstream, all about trying to do something that nobody wants you to do, and trying to have this kind of naive optimism in the face of huge tankers that are difficult to turn around. Is that it's not even really what you meant by that question?
No, it is. I mean, there is no right answer to that. We're just interested in how people doing what we think is systems innovation describe it.
I think I'm always searching for the kind of, like, the holy grail in this stuff is a kind of simple, light innovation that somehow spreads really quickly and changes the system. I think we're all in search of that. And it's a sort of huge frustration that I never find those things. But I do find other things that people are attracted to enough to sort of buy into and start making happen.
And do you feel that how you've described what you do or what your work is has changed a lot over, let's say, the last sort of 4 or 5 years?
Yeah, I suppose I used to say that what I did was service design, but I think it's much more about this kind of reframing and building a new system. The service design comes further down the line than that. I don't know, change the way that we describe it depending on the audience. So actually, I think it's harder to sell it as a process. It's easier to sell it as a kind of mission or set of values, or it's easier to say, we need these systems to be working in a different way because we need a world that looks like this. And we have a process for getting there. I think when Participle started talking about Beveridge 4.0 and that kind of mission, that was much more powerful than talking about the value a design process brings.
This is slightly going off camera, but yeah, like they're the only organisation I know that have done that.
Yeah,
and I think it is really powerful.
it is. Yeah, because I think people, those principles resonate with people and they buy into that vision. And they're kind of willing to trust you on how you get there. But it has got easier for us. It's got easier to do that since we had stuff that was out there and working as well.
Yeah, you've got practical examples that you can point to. And
yes.
So this question's more about us just trying to dig a bit deeper into like what do you actually do each week?
Yes.
Just to give a sense of...
So what did I do last week?
Yeah, what did you do?
Yeah, so last week I was in Copenhagen and I spent some time with a foundation called the Rockwool Foundation. And we were looking at how we can redesign parts of the Danish employment system. So we mapped out the existing system on the wall and we talked through various different approaches to labour market policy and that kind of thing. And all the time I was looking at it and thinking, this is entirely transactional. It's all about, the emphasis is all about job matching. It's about fitting people into holes, and the big question is whether the number of holes stays the same or whether the number of holes changes. That's the kind of big debate. And I was thinking none of this really is about the social context that people are living in. And what's interesting about the Danish system is that they have employment insurance, which used to last for 9 years and now lasts for 2 years. But it puts it's a very different relationship with the services on offer because you've paid over the odds for a long time and now you're out of work, you're receiving those services. But of course there's a group of people at the bottom who can't afford the insurance, and so what might a new form of insurance be for them? If we know that the power of networks and all of this, it's not so much receiving coaching and counselling, it may be about building a different kind of social fabric around people so that they are supported when they're out of work in a different way.
And if we were to ask you that question, because my understanding of work that you've done in the last few years, that you focus on like one theme or one area and then you move. So if we were to ask you on different themes what you were doing of a given week, would it be the same kinds of thing, just on a different
theme? I think it tends to be slightly different depending on the problem. I think that with the unemployment system, it's quite obviously a system, whereas starting some work on the mental health system in the north, that looks much more like a set of services at the moment. So I think the faster way into that is to spend time with people who have mental health issues and understand exactly what life looks like through their eyes, and then start to think how could that be different, and then look at what's in the community and in the professional delivery that could be used in a different way.
And what kind? This is just another end to that question, just around, what does a week look like in terms of, are you having lots of meetings? Are you using sort of design tools, and are you doing research into policy? Like what does a week look like in terms of actually your activity?
Yes, so because I am a designer by background, I don't feel very comfortable until I have spent time with the person who's experiencing the issue, so I can really understand what that feels like and looks like. And that also gives me different kinds of questions to be asking of either frontline workers or managers in the system or policy people or economists, I think. So, yeah, in the sort of early phase of a systems innovation project, I would be spending time with as many different parts of the system as I could and different roles within that system to try and understand what's going on. Of course, the difficulty with that is that you get immersed in the current. So, in a way, the only way of stepping outside of that is to spend time with the people who are experiencing the issue, because then you can kind of let the existing system go for a bit and just think, actually, if I was them, what would be the most amazing thing to have around me? Or what would it be that I want to do with my life? And think from that point of view.
And then,
Before the next question.
this isn't on the list, so the next one.
Okay. Well, that was a very sort of... What did you want me to do in that question? Did you want me to say, I might spend an hour talking to this person, and then I might be sitting on a housing estate watching this?
I think you said both of what
Okay.
I think that. I think mostly it has been more like, yeah, like people saying we had 3 meetings with this type of person, but I think that's more when people are working, you know, like someone like Lisa Harker in
Yeah.
her role in an organisation, trying to understand what she's doing.
Right. Yeah.
And I think you work in a very different type of organisation, so it's less
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah.
So, just going back to you sort of saying it feels like, or you describe your work as swimming upstream.
Yeah.
What do you need to be able to do your work? Like, I mean, that sounds like it's quite relentless and hard work sometimes, and you've sort of mentioned sort of naive optimism.
Yes.
But what are the things that you need around you, or what keeps you swimming?
Yeah. So I think I find it's important to have people around me who also have that naive optimism, because the force is in the opposite direction, so it does grind you down. I've also found it helpful we used a psychotherapist in the work that we've done before, and I think that has helped to just be reflective of where you're getting caught up in some of the dynamics that exist in the systems that you're working within. So sometimes we see that our teams take on some of the characteristics of older people's services or young people or that kind of thing. So I think that's been quite important. I find it very helpful to have people around me at a senior level who are championing the intent of what we're doing, so that whenever the people that we're working with start to feel uncertain or threatened or scared about the idea of moving forward in this way, they're able to hold that space and say, actually, we're all committed to this bigger goal. And if we focus on that, then we need to make the space for this to happen. I think that's really important. So all of our successful pieces of work have been with chief execs of local authorities who can really do that. What else is important? It's important to feel creative in the work. So to be able to have crazy ideas and follow them for a while and be comfortable with that, even though it's a messy process, there's a sort of waste in that process, but that's important to kind of keep the energy in the right place. It's important. I think it's really important to feel that what you're building is wanted by people on the ground. Because of course often we're trying to do things that people don't want. They don't want to be forced to get a job or that kind of thing. So it's really important that I feel that they feel what they're part of is valuable. That really is the thing that keeps me going when you get into the kind of difficult organisational change stuff, to be able to hold on to the fact that this feels right on the ground for people who are in it. That's important.
I'm going to miss out question 3, unless you feel particularly attached to it.
No, I read that one and I thought,
I
I
feel
personal
like
relationships.
yeah, and I feel like you've talked about that in your theory of change, like the role of sort of impact the system.
Yeah.
So can you point to an example of a systems change in action?
No, this is really hard. Yeah, when I think about this one, I don't know whether I'm thinking about systems or services really, because I think when I talk about, sometimes I teach students about different types of innovation, and one of the examples that I give is looking at the airline industry and the banking industry, and saying you can see that there have been various degrees of innovation in those industries. So there's been kind of incremental innovation where you've seen, so in the banking industry, that level of innovation would be something like Wonga, which is a sort of much better user experience of a payday loan system, very transparent, very straightforward. But it's an incremental innovation because it's something that existed already. It's just been made more user-friendly. Whereas if you look at, and then there are innovations that have required much greater intervention in the systems around them. So Bank of America did this interesting thing where they allowed people to round up their purchases and then they put the extra into the savings account for them. And that required some tricky changes to the way that retail systems communicate with the banks and that kind of thing. But it really is the more profound systems change has happened with services like Zopa, which is peer-to-peer lending and has grown to be a serious competitor to the big banks, but is based on a completely different infrastructure and set of values. And I guess it's been very similar in the airline industry that, when I was younger, the biggest sort of design effort was going into making a first-class seat the most comfortable flatbed experience ever, and that did have an impact on the industry. And now budget airlines are having a massive effect on the whole tourism system and infrastructure, not necessarily for the better, sometimes for the better. And that was a real rethink of the airline industry as a system and the relationships between airports and airlines and governments wanting to attract people in different ways.
And because you've meant my laptop's about to die, so I'm just going to close it. You've mentioned before in conversation, about the future of fish or the and is that something that you still think is a good example, or
I think it's a really clear example of how you could innovate at a systems level, taking that point approach, and it's quite a neat example because the supply and demand are really clear and the supply chain's very clear, and you can identify the players easily and see where the agendas and incentives are misaligned. And what to say about that? What I don't know is what the bigger effect of it has been. I can see that there are lots of businesses and partners making things happen. I can't tell what the impact.
And you can't tell partly because it's not out there, but also because of the time. like it's not been long enough? Or?
Yeah, it hasn't been long enough, but also because I think, and this probably will always be a problem. You can tell the impact on something if there's one institution that owns the problem. It's hard to tell the impact if it is made up of many different things, and unless you have a central measure that everybody is working towards and reporting against, how can you tell? So I think in a way the bigger impact is a narrative one, that here is this growing movement of businesses who are making a commercial success out of a different set of values, and that is very attractive. And the sort of more that grows a sort of coalition around it, the more powerful it will be as a force.
And then the last question, who or what inspires you?
Well, the future of fish inspires me, and I'm very good at these questions. If I have an answer for that.
Are there people in the UK, other than obviously the Participle, who you feel are doing work that you want to connect to, or that are inspiring you to move forward with what you want to do?
Yeah, it's not like there is nobody, because there's a big community of people who are trying to innovate in different ways and make things happen. I think I tend to get inspired by sort of historical figures like Ivan Illich and his kind of determination to change how we think about disabling systems and professions and things like that. A lot of them are my direct colleagues. I don't know. Can we stop and I have a think about this one? Because I really
And it's
stuck
fine
on
if
it, and
you
I can't
have-
say nothing because it's not true.
But you said Ivan Illich. But also, I think that is a really hard question, because in some ways a lot of the people doing, it's
It's sort of invisible, isn't
yeah,
it?
and it's also, I don't know, like some of the ways in which you're thinking about things are new, so therefore there's not people ahead that you can be, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know if that's true, because I think think about that. I think there are lots of people doing things that I can't do, that I don't know how to do and can't do. Especially ones that are kind of leading movements and organising coalitions and that kind of thing. It's not, I don't know how to do that. I think, yeah, sorry, this is taking
No.
isn't it?
Are you ready to record again when you can?
I've stopped. It's just easier, because usually people just burst it out and it says, oh, go back a minute. So I just leave it.
Oh, so it's on.
Yeah.
Oh.
We won't put any of this out.
I think I'm definitely inspired by a lot of the leaders that we work with in our work. I'm inspired by them because they are sitting with a kind of an organisation that they have to run and manage, and being part of this work at the same time. I guess I'm inspired by people who've made me think differently along the way. So people like Robin Murray and Sophia. Sophia was very inspirational to me years ago. And Charlie and... Yeah, there's a crap at this bit.
It's fine. It's not crap. I didn't ask my last interview that question, so I can't. I didn't ask Daniel that question.
He would have had good answers to that, as he gets quite inspired by it.
I should
Sort
email
of
him
tech
with that
startup people.
question. Yeah.
Yeah, can't answer that question.
That's
Yeah.
fine. Is there anything else that you feel like we haven't asked that would have, is there other things that you think are important to say?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I haven't said much about what I'm thinking about doing next, and I should probably say a bit about that. Yes. Because I'm thinking, well, I would like to set up a systems innovation incubator, or an incubator for collective impact. And so it looks like the first partner will be a mental health trust. And what I want to do is to understand that mental health space well enough to be able to find the right other partners in the mix. So that might be pharmaceuticals or insurers or big housing providers, those kind of partners, and think how in what way do we want to change that system, and what are the opportunities and innovations that each of those players are interested in order to make that happen. And the idea is that we go through an innovation process that is both user-centred and systemic in its thinking, and that we identify some new service opportunities that we can invite teams to take on as new ventures, and that we support them together to do that. And I suppose one of my big questions is, where do those teams come from, and how do we put a kind of governance structure around that supports them to really have kind of systems level ambition. Well, yeah, so one person who inspires me is Mark Ventresca at Oxford, when he talks about, let's not be social entrepreneurs only, but let's build systems. And how do we think about systems level leadership as opposed to individual leadership? So what are the tools and skills you need, or attitudes and outlooks you need to actually use what you're doing to create a bigger impact in the rest of the system?
Can you talk, that film is on the Point People website. That was the first thing we put up there.
Yes. Perfect.
Yeah, and I
That's
think
funny.
that was, I'm going off track a bit, but I put that up there in like 2011, and a lot of even the Point People were like, what does this mean?
What does that mean? Yes.
And so what do you think those sort of, what does leadership look like in that space? Like, what are the skills, the mindset?
Yeah.
The kind of...
Well, one of the things that Mark talks about when I've asked him about this is the idea that if you're thinking as a systems leader, you're thinking about growing your own network and set of connections. So how many different worlds are you a part of that you are able to then leverage to realise the goals that you're looking at? So I think that's definitely one part of it.
And that will come into play, for example, when you do this multi-angle attack.
Multi-angle attack, yes. Yeah. Yes. I mean, I think the problem will be that it will be very small scale to start with. But I think if you get those things right, they could have quite big impact, thinking in the mental health system, if people have a very, very different relationship with who's providing their medicine, and a very, very different relationship with the networks of support locally to them, and families are playing a different role, and employers are playing a different role. And if we can make that happen in a kind of microcosm somewhere, then I think we could really demonstrate a bigger shift. But I think what's going to be important in that is, I think there's two sides of it. One is one's disrupting business as usual, and one is actually creating a market for these new services to be out there and grow into, which is notoriously difficult in the NHS.
I had another question, but I've forgotten it. This is maybe slightly off, but I'm interested in just in terms of your thinking and what you're going on to do. Could you just talk a little bit about, so for example, there's this big trend of kind of labs in local government now.
Yeah.
Or you might take different people from those different points in the system and convene like a round table, or versus kind of what you're, or it's not necessarily versus, but in comparison to what you're talking about. I'm interested in those people trying to do these different kinds of
different ways of approaching it. Well, I think all of those approaches are necessary, because as well as trying to sort of attack a system from various sides, you also need to do it at various levels. So you need the perspective from people on the ground that gives you the opportunities, see those opportunities in a different way, but you also need those players from different stakeholder groups to come together and kind of figure out where the opportunity space is between each other, because unless they're motivated to make those changes, then it won't happen.
And then the lab bit would be more the building the capabilities of the organisations, so that's another level too. So you've got
yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. Yes. Yeah. So it's almost like a sort of inherent capability to be shifting the system in that direction. And what do you need to be able to do that and have that?
Any other things that you want to say about?
I think so.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.
That was really interesting. I wanted to ask you, actually, I did want to ask more about power and love, but maybe. I just think that's really, I think power particularly is, I think they're both really interesting.
I think they're both sort of underneath everything, aren't they?
Mm.
Yeah, so I was quite inspired by Adam Kahane's thinking about power and love, I suppose. When he says these two opposing forces are in everything. So in the work on apartheid that he did and the work on climate change that he's done, and each has its own weakness. So there's a kind of soppy side of love that removes people's power in a way, and there's a dominating side of power that also has a negative effect. It's not so much that my work sees those two in tension. It's just more that when I think tactically about designing these systems and services, I'm trying to deliberately design interactions that very clearly shift the power balance.
And create love.
And also allow love to be part of the liquid that makes it all work. So, yeah, and love is a really uncomfortable word in public services. It isn't comfortably understood. So easier to talk about empathy and relationships and that kind of thing.